Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be discussing the market cycle ROI, or return on investment. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, essentially, there's three main ways that we often measure the market cycle return on investment of Bitcoin. One of which is from the bottom from the last cycle, right? So think about November of 2022, December of 2018, so on and so forth. If you go over to the Bitcoin chart, you can see what I'm talking about. You can see a low here, November 2022, December 2018, January 2015, and so on and so forth. So this is the chart of the ROI of Bitcoin when you measure it from the bottom. You could make the argument that this over here is just one cycle and that you're not measuring it from that low, right? If you separate it into two cycles, you get the blue line right here, and then you get this line right here. But if you combine them, you get a cycle that looks like that, where it's this blue line up there. For purposes here, what we're going to do is we're going to actually just ignore it for now. And we're just going to look at this cycle compared to the last two cycles. Now, one of the things you should know is that last cycle, market cycle 4, maybe market cycle 3, depending on how you number the cycles, but last cycle ended on day 1059. The cycle before that ended on day 1067. Currently, we are on day 1016. All right. So if you've heard people say that the cycle ends in October, this is one of the places that they're likely getting it from, right? Because 1016, the last two cycles had their market cycle tops within about 8 days of each other, and that would correspond to about October if it were to happen again. Note, though, that Bitcoin so far has never actually peaked in October. We had a November top last cycle. The cycle before that, we had a December top. The cycle before that, we had a December top as well. If you treat this as a top, that one was actually in June. All right. So we've got a lot of different timings on the actual peak, but it is at least worth noting. The other thing I want to draw your attention to that, a lot of people are obviously talking about, and I don't want to ignore it. A lot of people have made the comparison between sort of, the low here and then this low and then that high right here, and then going into sort of the market cycle top. Now, one thing I will say is that for whatever reason, 124 seems to be a number that Bitcoin often stalls out at. You can see that Bitcoin just stalled out at around 124,000. In 2013, the top was 1242, right? So about 1/100th of the top that we've seen so far this time. In 2020, it also stalled out in August at 12,479. So every single one of these is like, 124, 12.4, or, 1.24K. The main difference between, say this top there and this one is the timing, right? This one was in November. This one so far has been in August. In 2020, this one here was in August, more similar to the one we currently have. But just keep that in mind. Now, when you look at the ROI from the bottom, that's one way to measure it. And, if it were to play out like the last couple of cycles, it could in fact mean that we will have a cycle top sometime in the fourth quarter of this year. Now, there is no such thing as a guarantee. It's possible that the cycle doesn't wait that long to top. It's also always possible that it goes longer. But just based on the last two cycles, in a couple of months, it really will make a lot more sense to start being more aware that the top for the market cycle could actually be in, right? If Bitcoin has not made a new high within a couple of months, it might be time to sort of reassess that as it having come sooner. But based on the last couple of cycles, you can see where the top ultimately was. Now, the other way you can measure it is from the halving. This is also a good way to measure the market cycle ROI. You can see after the first cycle, it actually topped out a lot sooner, only about 371 days after that halving. Cycle 2 was actually about 525 days. Cycle 3 was 546. We're currently on day 489. So if we just look at the last two, you can see where we are in reference to the last couple, right? So the last one ended on day 546. We're currently on day 488. Right. And again, the cycle before that one ended on day 525. So a lot of these, sort of point to, things playing out in a similar fashion. The one thing I've gone on and on about is diminishing returns. And it's always this thing where, I feel like even a lot of really, really smart people will sort of chime in and say that we won't have diminishing returns, or they'll measure it in kind of a weird way to say that it's not. But if you just measure it from the low, you can see that we are looking more than likely at diminishing returns, and it's currently experiencing diminishing returns. Back in 2024, we talked about how Bitcoin was more or less ahead of where it probably should be, and how it would stall out for about 6 to 9 months before the cycle continued. And that's basically what happened, right? You can see it got ahead of schedule, it then stalled out, and then it continued on. The cycle before that did the same thing, right? It got ahead of schedule, and then it stalled out until, it kind of was where the other cycle was. So this cycle has been the same way, right? It got ahead of the cycle before it, and then it stalled out until the other cycle caught up. So just be aware that when you measure it from the low, you can pretty clearly see diminishing returns. When you measure it from the halving, you can also pretty clearly see diminishing returns. And then the only other way to measure it that I think makes somewhat sense, and even this one is a little bit more dubious, which is a good thing I have my dubious speculation t-shirt on, is to measure it from the peak. Now, it doesn't really often make sense to measure things from the peak, because, like, why measure it from a period of complete, irrationality? But if you do measure it from the peak, you can also see that it kind of lines up with the last couple of cycles and is currently experiencing diminishing returns. And note that the 2 cycles ago, the cycle ended after day 1473 as measured from the peak. The cycle before that ended about day 1423, and we're currently on day 1382. Now, a lot of people have said, well, what happens if you take April of 2021 as the top instead of November? If you do that, it just simply looks like this. It would, arguably a lot further out. However, I think it does make sense ultimately to measure from the November top rather than the April top. While it is true that a lot of indicators suggested that April was the more euphoric time, at the end of the day, all models are wrong and some are useful. And at the end of the day, price action is all that matters, right? And technically speaking, Bitcoin put in a higher high in November of 2021 than in April. So as far as I'm concerned, that's the more relevant top, even though a lot of indicators sort of were firing off in April. But that's sort of an assessment of the market cycle ROI for Bitcoin. We'll check back in on this chart, in a couple months when things start to seem a little bit more complete, and check in if it's going more or less how we might expect, or if it's deviating. We'll obviously talk about that. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothe.cryptoverse.com, where you can, of course, get access to all of these charts. See you guys next time.